the market. Should have waited for that, right? So often our economic imaginations are really constrained by these dichotomies, whether that be capitalism versus socialism, or the state versus the market, or labor versus capital, et cetera. And one of the things that I think is really remarkable about the Commons is that it busts open so many of these false either ors and makes us realize that a different way is possible. The Commons really helps us to recognize that policy is not purely a mechanism of the government, and that we have the power to establish our own rules and systems of management. It reminds us also that the economy and even business are fundamentally constructs and words that we use to describe the way that we produce and provide for one another, and that it need not be controlled by the heavy hand of the state or the imaginary sort of guidance of the free market. Because as Thomas and Monroe, who are the authors of this paper so eloquently outlined in this paper, the Commons represents a paradigm shift in our economic thinking. So I remember when Thomas and Monroe began working on this paper, and the incredible complexity that emerged when they dove into the literature and realized that there were not only a lot of different understandings of what the Commons means and is, but also that the shape and form of the Commons really differs a lot across spaces and sectors. And as two of our brilliant young scholars, they were able to do the impossible, which was to make sense out of this complexity and to really synthesize and articulate some of the really important core ideas in less than 20 pages. And also in a truly, I think, eloquent, beautiful, and accessible manner. And so today we're going to be hearing from one of the core authors, Thomas Mande, who's going to present on to some of the core themes and ideas that are presented in the paper. And then we've got a really exciting opportunity to speak with one of the great minds and leading thinkers on the Commons, David Bollier, who's going to share some of his reflections and then engage in a dialogue with Thomas before we'll open it up to all of you to also share your reflections and questions that you might have on this really exciting topic. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Thomas to share with you some of his summaries from the paper on the Commons. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda, for that introduction. I really couldn't be more excited to have all of you here today to talk about this paper and then also to learn from all of you, because definitely I'm someone who's still, even having written this, new to this field. I know there's so much knowledge in this Zoom room, and I'm so excited to really talk with all of you today. So I'm going to share a screen. Can everyone see the presentation? All good? Okay, perfect. So this presentation, it's going to be sort of a brief overview of the paper we've written. Like Amanda said, Commons are an incredibly complex topic, and this presentation in no way can cover all of it. But this is kind of how we really tried to synthesize it down and capture some of the core ideas in the paper that Monroe and I wrote together. So a brief overview of the presentation. We're going to start out with envisioning the Commons, thinking about what is the Commons, what are the Commons, how should we think about this? Then we're going to talk about the tragedy of the Commons, this whole notion, and kind of the resurgence of Commons today. We're going to talk about Commons today and their benefits and how they get us out of that market state duopoly and towards a better future. And then finally, we're going to look towards that future and talk about what communities, what governments, and what businesses can do to kind of promote the Commons and expand the Commons in our world. So there are three definitions. We started out our paper with three big definitions of the Commons. We talk about the Commons first as an alternative system of resource governance. So resource governance systems are used to allocate decision-making power for who gets to use the resource, how that resource gets to be used, how benefits from that resource are distributed. And resource governance systems are super, super important. The two main ones we use in our societies are the market and the state, and this can apply to any resource, from a natural resource like the forest to a digital resource like a knowledge base, to something like labor, to something like money. The second way we conceptualize the Commons is as an entity. So when people refer to a Commons, this is kind of the understanding that we're talking about. And the really important thing to get here is that a Commons as an entity cannot just be a resource. A Commons is a resource, but then also a community that comes around this resource and builds governance structure, that builds rules, norms, co-produces the resource. This is actually one of David Bollier's quotes, but there's no Commons without commoners. So it's a really important notion to keep in mind. And then third is the Commons as an alternative social paradigm. So this is the most expansive understanding of the Commons, but it's this idea that the commons reorients how we think about our relationships to each other, our relationships to nature, our understanding that we are mutually dependent, that we have all of this shared heritage and shared wealth, and it is our responsibility to care for it, to build on it, and to cooperate with another and share all of this wealth together. And it's an idea that can really fundamentally shape how we imagine our economy, our politics, our social foundations. So in this paper, we do focus primarily on this first understanding. We do that because Monroe and I felt like it's the best way to kind of convey the core essence of the commons in a really effective way, to describe what the commons can do for us. But the way I like to explain the commons to people, if I'm talking about this just to a friend or someone who doesn't really know about it, is thinking about a forest. So with a forest, you have a forest, let's say there's a community around that community wants to use the forest to produce value, maybe as a cultural space, maybe to harvest lumber, for lots of different purposes. And there are a few ways they can govern this shared resource. So first, you can do it as a market. In a market, the forest would be privatized, split up, can be awarded to individuals or corporations, and then they would have the responsibility and choice to use the forest however they want, and whether they decide to care for the environment and protect the ecosystems would really be up to them. And then second, you can do it as a state. So then the state, a local, regional, and national government would control the forest. They can make it a protected area instead, or they could award it to corporations. It would be up to them what to do. And then the commons is kind of a third way of governing the resource, where instead of giving it off to the market or making it the property of the state, we say, let's let this community govern it directly. Let's let them come up with their own rules, their own ways to make sure that the health of the forest stays intact, to make sure that the value generated by the forest, again, whether it's a cultural space, whether as a natural resource, whether it's a refuge, somewhere to live, is shared among the community members who live there. So that's kind of this idea of the commons as a system of resource governance. But the commons can apply to a lot more than a forest. And these are sort of a few key characteristics of commons that are shared among lots of different types of commons. What I want to start with is this one on the left, diverse. Commons are exceptionally diverse. They, like I said, they can apply to really any kind of resource, and they're context-specific forms of governance. So it's the idea that based on the resource you have, whether it's a forest, whether it's an open source software platform, a digital knowledge platform, a community garden, the kind of structure you're going to create to share that resource, to govern it, to co-produce it, is going to be very different. It can be distributed globally online. It can be based on a local tight-knit community in person. So commons are very context-specific and diverse. Second is that commons are based on democratic rulemaking. So in a commons, everyone who's involved in caretaking that commons, which often is the entire community, gets a say in how the commons is governed. It's based on radical democracy, shared decision-making. A third characteristic of the commons is co-production. So this is the idea of a new way of producing things that's different from kind of the hierarchical model you see in a lot of corporations today, where you have a boss, you have people working under them, you have people working under them. In a commons, everyone are contributing together as equals with their different ideas and experiences to build something together in a horizontal kind of networked approach that then they all get to share together in the benefits. This fourth characteristic, indirect reciprocity, is the idea that instead of transactional relationships in a commons, where I give you something and then you give something back to me, in a commons, we all contribute and we all benefit from it. So it's less direct, it's more based on trust in each other, more based on this idea of community and sharing. And then finally, focus on meeting needs. So a commons is never designed to do an outside purpose, achieve an outside purpose like making a profit. A commons is designed because a community has a need, and that community feels the best way that they can meet that need is by caring for something and designing for something together. So what about the tragedy? So when I first got into learning about the commons, the first notion that came to my mind, and I'm sure is the case for many of you, is this idea of the tragedy of the commons. But before we talk about that and Garrett Hardin, I want to go a little bit back further in commons history. Commons are not new. Commons have been around for thousands of years. Communities all over the world have used commons-based resource governance to care for shared resources, to farm, to have subsistence communities, have flourishing communities and shared cultures. Commons are not new. They're very old and widely used. And the history of opposition to commons is very, very violent. You can look back to, I think, as early as maybe 1300, but really in the 1500s, you have this widespread set of enclosures that start in Europe, where you have these elites who want to be able to generate wealth from the land, and they take these subsistence lands where farmers are managing as a commons, and they privatize them. They force commoners off of them. They make these commoners work for wage laborers to generate profits for these elites. And this happened in Europe. It happened all over the world through the process of colonization, where people who were managing land as a common had that land torn away from them and then privatized so elites could make profits off of it. So understanding the commons is essential to understanding kind of the past of global capital. Okay, so tragedy of the commons. So then you have Garrett Hardin come in with this notion of the tragedy of commons. And this is basically the idea that the commons, any common resource, people are going to naturally over exploit it because people aren't disciplined and they can't cooperate. And therefore, we shouldn't let anything be a commons and we should privatize pretty much everything. Was kind of this idea of the tragedy of commons. And the thing about this idea is it's based on this huge misperception of what the commons really are. Because like we talked about in the intro, a commons has to have a resource in a community. And Garrett Hardin was just talking about situations where there's this resource, but those community structures around the resource to care for it and use it and govern it are missing. So this was a really huge misconception, but a misconception that really caught on and still used to justify today. Oh yeah, the slides. I can just give everybody the slides. That's a great idea. Whoever.
Don't worry, Thomas. You just keep on talking. I'll get a secure version of the slides and send the link in the chat.
Okay. Sorry for the hecticness, everybody. But yeah, okay. So Garrett Hardin, he says this. He's based on a misconception. It catches on. But then Elinor Ostrom, who kind of is a little bit of a hero in this story, she was an economist. She won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her work that showed that the commons can actually be just as effective at governing shared resources. She really focused on natural resources, but be just effective as the market and state at caring for these resources and making the resource useful to communities. And today, commons are enjoying a big resurgence. There are lots of new commons, lots more interest in the commons, and part of that's due to Ostrom, but part of that's due to other great work by people like David Bollier and lots of others. And I'll talk about all those new commons now. So yeah, commons today, there are kind of four big types of commons that we focus on in our paper. First is natural resource commons. So we sort of already talked about that, the idea that you can have a shared natural resource, something like a forest, like a lake, an irrigation system, a river, and manage it as a commons with a local community. The second type of the commons that we talk about is urban commons. So urban commons are a response to the privatization that we're seeing occurring in cities all over the world, where less and less space is common and shared wealth and more is privatized and used to generate profit. You have to have money to access it. And urban commons push back against that, and they are projects led by people living in cities to create things like community garden, community-owned housing, different ways that you can create in this city that should be a laboratory for coming together and creating things that you can get people to come together. You can create these open spaces and open connections. Then there are also a few cities, a bunch of cities actually, that have made the commons a bigger part of their agenda. Ghent, for example, is a great example. They put out a common transition plan to really expand the commons there. They have over 500 commons projects going on right now, which is 10 times what they had a decade ago, because they've really dedicated to doing this. Oh, we got the big slides back. Awesome. So that's urban commons. And then, whoa, okay. Now I kind of can't see it now. Yeah, we're back. Yeah, so urban commons, digital commons, I think, are actually the most exciting type of common. The commons people are most excited about today, because this idea is that a lot of the value we have in our economies today, in our lives today, are things that exist in the digital realm, different knowledge, different designs, different pieces of science. And all of these things can be freely reproduced over and over and over again. There's no additional marginal cost to producing them each time. So there's really no reason any of it should be scarce, except for the fact that scarcity is good for profit. So this idea of digital commons is that, hey, let's, instead of privatizing everything and having all these intellectual property regimes, we co-produce this knowledge together, because the commons are very, very creative. We co-produce this knowledge and we freely share it to all who need it. And in doing so, we can really expand the total amount of public knowledge available to everybody and really improve the lives of lots of people. I mean, there are a lot of people who suffer from the way that knowledge is privatized. Think COVID and vaccines. Think all of these designs for renewable energy systems that we have out there. If all of this was freely shared, a lot of people could be much better off. And then finally, we have financial commons, which are commons organized around getting our money system to be based on commons principles like community design, horizontality, democracy, and community wealth building. New slide. Cool. So yeah, I'll run through a few of the other benefits of a commons approach. So a few of the general benefits. So first, we kind of laid out 8 transitions that we see when we implement the commons. So these first 4 are transitions or benefits that you see in all types of commons. The last 4 are more specific. So first, you have this transition to extraction to building community wealth. So our current economic system, when you privatize everything, think of a forest, if it's owned by, let's say, some multinational corporation that's cutting down trees and doing all these things, the profit generated for them, first of all, they destroy the resource, but also that profit goes back to the people who own the corporation and the shareholders, who are often really wealthy people not living in the community. So by localizing and democratizing control over different resources, the people who benefit from those resources are actually the people living in the communities, and communities are able to build their wealth instead of having it siphoned off to people who already have too much. Second is a shift from transactional relationships and competition to indirect reciprocity and collaboration. One of the coolest things about commons is that when you have one type of commons, people often build other commons and cultures of care around it. So let's say you have a community-owned housing program where people are working together to maintain this housing and collectively pay rent. If you all want to pay rent together, then you're going to be looking out for your neighbor and making sure they have a job, making sure their kids are cared for, making sure they're doing okay if they get sick. And this is something you can see in real life, where commons lead to more commons and lead to more care, which is something we desperately need in our world. The third is that you have solutions, one size fits all solutions to local context specific solutions. I think people agree more and more that communities really do know what's best for them. And with the commons, you're giving those communities the power to design their own solutions so that they can make solutions that are context specific, that meet their needs, that meet their cultures, that are best for what they actually need. And then finally, you have a shift of decision-making by the elite few to everyday democracy for the many. Right now, the biggest decisions about pretty much everything that happens in our society are controlled by the economic elite and the political elite, and common people have much less say. The commons are a form itself of changing who has power in our economy and in our world and giving it to everyday people. It's a very transformational concept. Yeah, next slide. So these are specific to the 4 types of commons we talked about. But first, environmental degradation to flourishing ecosystems. By implementing the commons, we're getting rid of this harmful, extractive, exploitative paradigm that we currently approach the environment with, and we're transitioning to a system where care for the environment is going to be a fundamental part of it. Because if you're subsisting off this environment, if this environment is a part of your community, you're going to care for it. Second, cities that exacerbate inequality, cities that keep wealthy people in one place, that keep poor people in another place, that fragment communities into cities that heal inequality through increasing public wealth, through increasing common spaces, through increasing collaboration. Then third, privatize knowledge to shared knowledge and digital co-creation, like we talked about. We can move away from this intellectual property paradigm that we have right now into a new paradigm where we're co-creating and sharing knowledge and using it for the betterment of people all over the world. And finally, a money system that concentrates wealth through banking, that money creation controlled by private banks, lots of private accumulation, to a money system that shares prosperity through community created currencies, community run banking operations, mutual credit, crowdfunding, systems like that. Okay, yeah, one more slide. Yeah, finally, so creating more commons. So we talked on sort of 3 levels that we need to work on towards creating more commons. Communities, so communities are at the forefront of this process. Kind of 2 big categories, like subcategories here, is that communities can go and create more commons. So they can create community gardens, they can create housing commons, they can create complementary community currencies, but then also building broader commons movements. So we have commons movements blossoming all over the world where communities are bringing tons of people together, coalition building, and fighting for increase in the commons on a really broad scale. Second is government. So government here, their role is as a supporting partner in this struggle. And this can mean setting up government initiatives like we talked about in Ghent. The city of Bologna has one where they had a common resolution. That was a big deal. Also, I think it was Ecuador had put in place a national plan to increase the commons. So kind of those initiatives help. Legal structures that support commoning also really help. And then finally, giving financial support to commons projects, because common projects often really need it. And then finally, business, not in the traditional sense of business, but businesses as thinking about, okay, how can we not be extractive? How can we maybe build on a shared knowledge commons and provide a service? So let's say, great example of this is, let's say there's an open design commons. So open design is something like, for affordable housing, you let anybody anywhere put their ideas online for how we can build more affordable housing, what are really cheap, cost-effective plans. that then instead of manufacturing on a global supply chain, we can manufacture locally. Then a business that supports the commons could be a local business that takes those open designs instead of privatizing them, then provides a service of actually helping communities assemble that housing that they need. That's one example. Yeah, so this wraps up my presentation. I know that was really brief. I know it was fast. I'm sorry there was a disruption in the middle. Hopefully that was a decent overview of the commons, and we definitely want to delve a lot more into examples, into kind of nuance here in the discussion that will follow. But yeah, I'm actually gonna turn it over now, introducing our very special guest, David Bollier. David is an author. He's a blogger, an activist, consultant who explores the commons as a new paradigm of economics, politics, and culture. He's worked on this project of the commons for 20 years, co-founded the Commons Strategy Group in 2010, and more recently became director of Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. David's someone who I looked up to an incredible amount. I cited his research all throughout my paper. He's been formative to my own understanding of an interest in the commons. I'm incredibly excited that he's joined us here today. And I really can't wait to learn from what he has to say. So thank you all for listening. And without further ado, I'm turning it over to David.
Thank you for that introduction, Thomas. And I want to thank you for your synthesis paper. As I was saying earlier, it's really difficult to synthesize or distill some of the lessons of the commons because there are many schools of thought and approaches, and yet there are certain commonalities. So your paper is a great place to start in terms of getting a grasp of all that. Having said that, I have to confess that some of my approach differs a bit from that of Ostrom, and in the sense that I don't think commons are chiefly about resource management, important as that is, because a lot of that immediately slips into an economistic framework of thought, the whole rational actor framework of how we relate to each other, and the whole set of property relations and a set of separations between us and nature, between us and each other. And so if you take the idea of a paradigm shift seriously, you have to realize that you have to go pretty deep to start to uproot some habits of thought. And I think it even penetrates down to the level of language, because there's so many words that have embedded valences of meaning or implications that I think the commons overthrows. We're accustomed in modern life, especially modern capitalism, to see things as fixed and having essential characters, to deal in nouns. I think the commons is more about verbs and process. And so this is kind of my co-author Silke Helfrich and I discovered in the course of researching our book Free, Fair, and Alive that many of the received terms and concepts and ways of analysis were not described in the commons that we had seen. We had seen dozens. And so we attempted to try to get a different framework for understanding commons that was more about social processes and what we called patterns of commoning. So what manifested from the bottom up as recurrent patterns to solving similar problems. So there was not a single blueprint or universalistic analysis, but something that was very situational and context dependent in how it manifested. So that's one reason you can see such a huge diversity of commons, yet there are certain core process elements that you see. So we tried to distill that in what we eventually called the Triad of Commons, where we had three different spheres of patterns of commoning: social life, peer governance, and I'm suddenly blanking on. I've spent so many years doing this, but the peer governance, provisioning, and social provisioning as an alternative to production. And we wanted to see what are the inner social dimensions of commoning. You know, economics has homo economicus, in which they purport that a rational individual is advancing their material self-interest, and you know the whole story on that. Well, it's a kind of a cartoon of what a human being really is. And we wanted to see how the commons had this richer dimensions of inner life and social interactions, which was inherently generative when structured properly. And so there's a whole value creation theory implicit in the commons, which is very different from the market price transactional theory of how value is created in standard economics. So we wanted to go very deeply in that in developing a new interpretive framework for understanding what's going on in the commons. How do people interact with each other in stable, ongoing ways? How do they align their needs and interests? What dynamic feedback loops are there? How do you build trust and fairness and transparency in the system? These are the kinds of questions that are really about the commons as a social system and paradigm, as opposed to an unowned resource. So it's a matter of what you start to foreground in your analysis. It's not as if, quote, resources don't matter, but as a commoner, I like to refer to resources as care wealth. In other words, it's not implicitly a commodity that is defined by price. It's something that I care about, that perhaps my identity and social experience and traditions are wrapped up in. So I treat it in a different way, as opposed to just something separate from me. And that's what a lot of commons do. They break down these separations or binaries that we in modern life take for granted, but in fact, they're integrated. It's not as if there's rational and irrational, or individual and collective, or public and private. These start to blur, they start to become integrated in a way that confounds the standard economic paradigm. So once you start to get into that mindset and worldview, you start to realize that some of the legacy vocabularies and concepts just are not capturing what's going on. And indeed, it's not just a critique of that, it's a prospective rethinking of how we talk about individual agency, resources, and property rights. We get into relationality as the primary way of talking about it. And so, for example, there's a chapter in our book about relationalized property. And I think that the idea is that people have certain social connections and commitments to a property, which is very different from standard property theory is, I own it, I'll do whatever the hell I want with it. So, and that's why standard economics can't really understand open source software, which is profoundly and almost definitionally social and relational. So those are a few, let me just conclude with a few thoughts about what I see as hotspots or ideas that preoccupy me in terms of moving the commons forward in contemporary life. Thomas mentioned urban commons. I think that is one of the more important crucibles for change, because I think political action and innovation is more possible there than at the national level, which is pretty much locked up, ideologically driven, or corrupt. And it's very difficult at the national level to make more headway, but there's a little more open space in local settings or regional urban settings. And especially in Europe, we're seeing a lot of this in places like Amsterdam and Barcelona, where they're experimenting in good faith and they're adopting donut economics and trying to move things forward. But I would just add to that description that state power has its own priorities and dynamics, which are often at odds with the commons. So it's not as if it's just going to suddenly sign up and become a partner with providing legal support or finance for commons. I think that that's going to be a political struggle. And I think it's also, there's different philosophical commitments that bureaucracy and elected politics has relative to bottom-up commoning. And this is an unresolved issue, how that's going to play out. But I think we need to be mindful of those tensions. But I would just add to all that even small working models of commons can be tremendously catalytic, because they show a functional alternative and they function as a moral indictment of the existing system, the way that open source software did in the 1990s, late 90s. It was minuscule in any market sense, and it wasn't even a market, but it had Microsoft very worried. And in fact, open source software has proven to be a transformative force within proprietary software. And the same could be said for local organic food in its day. Very small, but it pioneered a different way of being that, of course, has been partly co-opted by big ag, but it was the staging area for a different transformative model in the way I think commons often can be. I'll just tick down a few other general categories and then we can get into it more in the Q&A if people are interested. One is, I think there's a real need to develop what I call relationalized finance forms. There's a lot of existing systems like CSA farms or community land trusts or alternative currencies or new types of digital organizations, which don't depend upon extractive capitalist debt and equity. They're community funded and community accountable pools of money. And I think that this is really a critical turn we need to make to get to, call it post-growth finance that doesn't require the extractivism that we have of capitalist finance. So that's one area I think rich with possibility and need. Another is developing the infrastructures to support commons, because it should not have to be a heroic effort by one person or a group of people to create a new commons when a lot of the paradigms are out there, but there's not the, say, the digital protocols, there's not the legal organizational support or recognition by the state. You know, sometimes the state has to decriminalize things like seed sharing. I'd like to suggest we think about infrastructures as a way to accelerate and help scale more quickly commoning. Aligned with that are new organizational forms that can help move it forward beyond, you know, profit, nonprofit, and even for benefit companies. I think we need to explore things like platform cooperatives, which are user and member benefit co-ops through digital platforms. Things like Cosmo local production, where you have open source sharing of design and knowledge, but then it's locally used often to build physical things like furniture, even cars, housing. I think there's huge potential for reducing carbon footprint from that kind of production model, but that too gets wrapped up into the finance because, you know, how do you finance something that you can't offer the intellectual property as collateral for? How do you make that real at a local level? So there's things to be built out, but many functional small scale models already there. And then finally, I think more broadly, we need to find ways for translocal and transnational collaborations of commoners to occur more easily, because there's huge amounts of knowledge out there and cross-fertilizing ideas that can't speak to each other. I'm reminded of a quote by this Dutch or Belgian designer, Thomas Lomé, who I often cite, who said, the next big thing will be a lot of small things. And I think having place-specific, place-committed, and size-appropriate models of commons has huge catalytic implication that conventional politics and economics doesn't see right now because they think that only top-down policy-driven approaches can work. There will be a role for those, of course, but we need to change the sort of bottom-up social DNA of things if it's truly going to be transformative. And I will just conclude by giving a pitch for my just released book, which is an attempt to try to knit a lot of these things together. I produced the Commoners Catalog for Change-Making, Tools for the Transition Ahead, which is modeled in the Whole Earth catalog from the 1970s of having lots of small examples that give insight into this, you might say, counterculture of commoning, which is out there and robust, but just not seen or given a platform by the standard respectable platforms. And by the way, that's available both through bookstores and the rest, but it's online for free at commonerscatalog.org as a free flip book. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Thomas, and we can have a brief dialogue before opening it up to everyone.
I think we've decided we're just going to open it up now since only 20 minutes left. So I'll throw it to Amanda.
Okay.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, I just really, really want to thank you both. You were able to cover such an incredible depth and also scope of information, but in a really accessible and engaging way. So I want to thank you for that. I know it's a challenging topic. So we already have a few questions which have come in from the chat, but I'd also like to just encourage anybody, if there's any reflections that you have or questions that you would like to ask, either put it in the chat, or you can also raise your hand if you prefer to ask directly. So one of the questions is going to first go to you, Thomas, and it comes from Charlie. And they're asking that it sounds like the commons as a framework of governance embodies and expresses a certain logic, a logic of reciprocity or a logic of group interests. Privatization also embodies and expresses a logic, the logic of private profit. What advantages do you think this latter logic had historically that allowed privatization to prevail? And what do you think is different about today that could potentially support the reemergence of commons?
Yeah, I'll go. And then David, you're welcome to chime in after me. I think in terms of advantages that privatization had historically is money and the power to do violence. A lot of times this privatization was backed up by the state, which allowed this violence to occur. A lot of the time, like I talked about, these enclosures, people would come in and force people off the land, and commoners fought back. This is something important and not talked about that much, that commoners fought back a lot. It's just the forces of money and wealth had more power than these commoner forces, and they were able to take the land and then enforce these regimes. And the thing is that once private interest, private capital had taken over the land and divided it up and pushed commoners off and forced them into wage labor and scarcity on that same land, it makes it much harder for commoners to come together and push back. So I think that is why private interests have won historically, is just an imbalance of power. And I think about what's different about today, in my opinion, are these digital commons that we've talked about. The fact that so much knowledge and ideas are shared digitally and that are freely reproducible that just don't make sense with private and market logic. And there's no reason these ideas should be scarce, because they're, first of all, on a moral level, they're built off of all of our shared knowledge that's come from generations of learning, but also on a practical level, you can reproduce them at no added cost, and people have needs and those needs should be met. So I think that is a really disruptive new element of our current economy that's going to give commoners a big edge going forward.
I love that. Would you like to add anything, David?
Well, I would just add that, I think that the market system has an ability to scale more rapidly, in part because it uses the money and the exchange value as opposed to use value, which is embedded. And they basically disembed value from the environment, from community, from tradition. And so the whole theory of value that they have allows for it to be scaled. On top of that, to ally with the state and give itself political support. So that's one reason why I think it's prevailed so much. But let's just, as Thomas pointed out, it did so through dispossession and coercion and violence, but also through the externalization of costs onto the environment, which, it never had a holistic theory of value in a finite world. It's sort of creating I just heard a story the other day about space junk and how basically it's creating all sorts of problems in outer space, and because of the debris is running into things. Well, that's the same dynamic of colonization, the externalization of costs and taking things by violence. So there is a political struggle here.
I love that. Thank you so much. Both incredible answers. So I've got another question, which comes from Dora, and it is, what is your answer to the quote, "A society that puts equality before freedom will get neither, and a society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both"?
Read the second one again.
A society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both.
Well, I think that, freedom is the issue here, but freedom can be a slippery word in the sense, is it individual license, or is it freedom within a realistic sense of the human condition? And I think that we are born interconnected and interdependent in a finite world that we have to steward, as opposed to the libertarian dream of being totally these atomistic individuals who can do whatever the hell they want. And I think that humanity may be sort of coming to an inflection point of having to grapple with the reality of the human condition instead of having to being able to or feeling they can displace all this stuff into the world. So I don't like to get too far down the path of these grand abstractions, because they become disconnected from the on the ground realities. They're important traditions. I know David Graeber in his new book, The Dawn of Everything, deals with this very question and how freedom is the issue, but it gets diverted into lots of ideological manipulations.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to add anything, Thomas, to that?
Yeah, sure. Just briefly. I think, like David was saying, it's about our conception of freedom. I think, to me, someone who has to work like 15 hours a day in a sweatshop or at a minimum wage job that is not paying a living wage, I don't see a high degree of freedom for that people. And commons are actually about giving people more freedom by sharing wealth, by increasing the amount of public wealth that we have together so they can devote their lives to meaningful pursuits instead of being forced in our current economy to labor constantly just to be able to survive. So I think thinking about freedom in that way is important to seeing the way.
Add one other note to that. By decommodifying ourselves, reducing our dependence on markets, we open up a range of possibilities for engaging with each other in different ways and producing in different ways. So you could say that freedom and diversity is enhanced by reducing our dependence on a highly centralized and rigidly controlled top-down economy.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's very spot on. I see we have a hand raised by Shruti. Would you like to ask a question?
Hi, hello, good evening. Hello, sir, and greeting from India. So here it's the night time. So still good morning to all of you. And thank you so much, sir, for the beautiful session and for the beautiful knowledge that you have shared among all of us. So the question is, when we talk about well-being economy, so the concept of happiness economy and the concept of going beyond GDP also lies in between somewhere, because the concept of well-being economy somewhere attached to go that talks about going beyond GDP. So what insight you would like to give on this topic of going beyond GDP and happiness economy together?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Brilliant question. Absolutely love it.
I think that's an important tradition in trying to deconstruct the prevailing economic paradigm, which thinks that we're only going to be happy if we maximize our utility in materialistic money ways. So that's a great access point for talking more broadly about what economics should be talking about. And they've just become so ingrown and sterile as an intellectual philosophy that we need to open it up. I like to think that the Commons allows us to entertain a different paradigm of humanity. And we still need to meet needs, but not necessarily through market transactions or the production process of modern industry. And we're finding that those are harmful, very harmful to the earth in any case. So I would just sort of endorse your general proposition that we need to start talking about human happiness and how it manifests in collective context, as opposed to having these fantasies of individual liberation by ourselves and money.
Absolutely. Do you want to add anything, Thomas?
I think commons are the perfect example about how we can improve people's lives in a like a perfect case for going beyond GDP, because in a commons are not good for the GDP because you're decommodifying and demarketizing things. But you can see how let's take this idea of knowledge use, when you deprivatize it, when you make it public, when you make it shared, it's bad for the GDP, but it's good for people. Because more people have access to this. So I think commons are a perfect example we can think of. Look how we have more well-being with less GDP. And also we have an expert on this subject of measurement on the call, Dirk Phillipson. So if you're curious about beyond GDP, definitely reach out to him.
Absolutely. I'll maybe just add one more point here, just along the connection between the commons and the well-being economy movement more broadly, right? So I think what we've been hearing from both Thomas and David is really about this fundamental paradigm shift, right? So a really question of what matters in life. What are the things that we really truly value and that are important for our collective flourishing and for the well-being of our people and planet, and to define progress by that, right? And then that requiring then to look at the economy as in service of the achievement of well-being, as opposed to the economy's purpose being to generate profits and wealth, right? And so I think very much what the Commons provides is really practical, contextual examples of alternative ways in which we can redesign the ways in which we provide for one another and manage that system so that it aligns with our values and actually contributes to the betterment of people and planet. Yeah. So we have a really maybe great follow-up question here as well, which comes from Mark, and he's really interested, in thinking about what role does education play in supporting a transition to a commons paradigm, because currently people are very much taught to normalize market values and logic. Do we think that we need to transform our systems of education to allow change to take root in society?
We obviously do. That's of course a very difficult challenge. We know how entrenched higher education is, for example, in certain modes of thinking. There are some invaluable critiques of conventional learning or education, which should become learning, by people like even Illich, who wrote extensively about how the credentialism and rigidity of conventional education, often to sort of guide you into a capitalist career, are not really about learning. So I think a lot of this will have to take place outside of conventional institutions, which don't really have a huge incentive to transform themselves, and indeed big resistance to it. So, I wish I had a quick answer for that, but I think we have to start to educating ourselves in a more practical, on the ground way with each other, than look to some of the larger institutions to make that transition. I wish I had more to say.
Love that. Thomas, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with everything David said. It's not like conventional education is going to change in big enough way anytime soon. So I think the responsibility is on all of us to kind of have these conversations with our friends, with our circles, and keep building on these ideas.
I love that. And so we have one final question. I know I haven't been able to get to everybody's, but this comes from Jack. And he's asking that the question that it sounds like for the commons as defined here, it doesn't include what I would include were commoners or stakeholders when they're removed by distance or time. So like the atmosphere, the Amazon, fishing in international waters, etc. So does it mean that in order to address these issues with these commons, can we address these issues with the commons, or are the speakers suggesting that there's some other sort of model than the commons required in order to deal with these?
Well, see, I don't see those as commons. They're common pool resources that they're in need of commons governance. And the nation state and international treaty organizations have singularly failed to provide that kind of responsible governance. And when they do step into it, as they did with the law of the sea and deep sea minerals, they don't try to do it to preserve it as the common heritage of humankind, as the treaty says, but more about how can we all get our fair market share for exploiting it. So part of the problem is the nation state and international treaty bodies do not want to act as responsible stewards of the commons. And part of the challenge is creating new governance models for fisheries, for oceans and things like that, that don't partake of the pathologies of the market state system. And so I'm sorry to state it so bluntly, but there's major structural issues here in trying to get the commons to supplant those pathologies, as opposed to saying, oh, if we just get another international treaty, or if this government will just take the lead, that's not going to be enough. We have to change the bottom-up logic and find ways for them to support place-based commoning.
Really, really great point. Anything you'd like to add, Thomas?
No, that was spot on. Nothing to add.
Okay, I love it. So I'm conscious that we have 5 more minutes here. And so I would just like, there was a wonderful question that came in around what are WEAll's plans also in terms of next steps, right? In terms of building on this paper and the incredible inputs and insights that we've received from David here today as well. So at WEAll, obviously, our strategy and our aim is to not only demystify a lot of the ideas that exist within current the wellbeing economy space, but also then to utilize that as foundations for action. Yeah. And so in many ways, our work is focused in building place-based hubs, so where civil society, private and public actors can come together into space and to try to advocate and build these kind of common reforms, but also at the transnational level, which I think is really exciting, what you were speaking about, David. There is a need for, I think, greater visioning and consideration of what kind of fundamental reforms are needed in order to allow space for transnational commoning. And so part of our work this year is going to be focused on bringing greater thought leadership and also connecting members and movements and organizations that are really trying to push for change within the global economic architecture. And so I'd really welcome anybody who is interested in continuing to engage on this topic in the global economic system, or wanting to also connect with other citizens and activists and change makers and intellectuals in your location as well, to join WEAll as a member, to connect with us, to follow up. And also, please, of course, check out the WEAll briefing paper on the Commons, and then also David's new incredible book as well, which it sounds like an incredible resource for us in order to look at the catalog of the Commoners catalog for change making. And so with this, I want to just thank you all for taking time to be here. We've had an incredible turnout, and I look forward to continuing this dialogue and connecting and collaborating with you all again soon. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to put a link to David's book here also for everyone, and a link to the paper in case anyone wants to download it. I have a very long link here, so my apologies. Yeah, it takes you to your Google. Yeah, but then you can see all of your books also.
Don't use that link. Use the just www.commonerscatalog.org.
Okay, great. You're so fast, Lisa. So great. Well, thank you so much. Thomas, David, you are incredible speakers. My goodness, and what brilliant minds you have.